or the LRCFT. Want to welcome folks to today's workshop. I will these slides will be available, but even better yet, I'm gonna have create some access to some of the area where actually Los Rios is pretty good about creating content to prepare future candidates. So I'll be sharing some of those resources as well. The district itself has created some materials to help folks prepare for the interviews, not just the interviews, but applying for full-time positions, and then also even created this this PDF with a bunch of sample questions to help folks prepare. So I'll be I can share this material, but also we'll be letting folks know where they can find more material. So so what we're going to be doing today is reviewing the process, just to give folks an idea of what they can expect when they apply for a full-time position, what the interview process looks like, and then going into a conversation, right, about what are some ways to prepare for this process, right? So, I've been, fortunate that obviously I've gone through the process of going through the interview process, but then have also had the experience of serving on various committees, right? So I feel comfortable, sharing different parts of the process, sharing my experience in serving on different committees, and then sharing the difference between strong candidates and candidates that don't do quite as well. So happy to share all of about as much as I can from those experiences, right, without obviously going into any unique or specific details of a particular candidate, right, or a particular position. So let's get started. So the interview committee, it's formed. The search committee is formed right when the position becomes available, and it includes the following roles, right? Like for sure, there has to be a committee chair, an equity representative, and then there are different the department members, right? So the committee chair is typically the dean of the hiring department, the equity representative, depending on the type of position, right? But assuming that we're talking about faculty positions, the equity representative is typically a faculty member from another department outside of another department outside of the hiring department, and then the various department members, right, include like the chair of that department, and then possibly other folks that work in that department. This can include faculty and staff, right? And so that's what the committee looks like. And the more important part about that, the committee is that when the committee forms, they begin to work on developing the screening criteria and the interview questions for the search, right? And so when both of these things are created, they come directly from the job description. So I want to highlight that because that is so important, right? You want to familiarize yourself with the job description, right? Because you want the job description, when we've done other workshops, when we talk about how to prepare to apply for a full-time position, we talk about organizing your materials, right? Your professional materials, like your resume, your cover letter. We emphasize that you should look at the job description to present your materials, right, and to present your strengths to the best that you can to that job description, because the job description is gonna inform the screening criteria, right? Well, that job description is also gonna inform the questions that are gonna be generated for the interview, right? So if you look at the job description, you can kind of anticipate some general questions that may come up, right? And we'll talk about that in a little bit as we go into more specifics. But I want to just highlight that, and this is something that I'm going to be you know, bringing up, I'm going to sound like a broken record. I feel like throughout this workshop, because I'm going to keep emphasizing, right, to familiarize yourself with the job description. But again, that's because that's the tool that the committee uses, right? Like that's the tool that's like limiting what the committee can come up with in terms of questions. So it's important to become familiarized with that. Are there any, feel free to engage with the chat, everybody. If there are questions, feel free to, you know, write them as I go in the chat, but also feel free to, you know, we're a small enough group, I believe, that we can, you know, engage with conversation. So if there are, you know, questions, feel free to, yeah, go ahead.
So it sounds like in the interview committee, there will typically be about 4 or 5 people. Does that sound about right, total?
Probably more than that. Probably, you know, probably about, I would say 6 to 8 feels more.
All
I'm
right.
thinking about, yeah, I'm thinking about my my interview, and I feel like, you know, it was like a U, right? There was like maybe like, I want to say it was like 3 people on one side, about another 4 on the in the front of me, and then another 3, right? So they can be pretty, you know, they can be pretty extensive. But I would say, yeah, 4 feels I
was
short.
just thinking, because my department is pretty small, and I know I think not all of them have gone through the hiring for the best training. So yeah, I was just wondering about that, because 4 sounds better than 8 to me.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you know, one of the things that I want to talk about today is that, you know, it really, at least this is my experience now. You know, obviously I'm speaking from a position that's like not anxious about it because I'm not going through, you know, the interview. But once you become, or once hopefully after I break, or as I keep breaking down the process, you'll see that it's so formal that it doesn't even matter whether it's like 14 or 4, in the sense that it matters to the audience, but like no one individual weighs more, right? Like no, you know, like it does.
Sure.
And they're all just going off of the same. They're all very scripted. You know what I mean? It's a very scripted. It's a very formal process. So, you know, if you have 4 people in the committee, you know, those 4 people are just gonna ask 2 questions as opposed to 1. Anyway. Yeah. Yep. So that's why I make that reference. But again, of course, it matters when you're sitting there and you have, you know, the difference between, you know, having 4 people look at you and 16 people look at you is quite significant. Yeah, but does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. There's another question.
This is good. Yes, this is good in there. So my question is the interview, is it one go or is it multi-step interviews like that? You have 1 and 2 or 3?
Yeah, so typically at Los Rios is a 2-tier process, right? It was actually like a 3-tier process. The first tier is the screening, right? And screening happens at 2 levels. So first HR screens, right? Then the committee screens. So there's a screening process, and then there's the interview process. The first interview process, which is composed of this committee that I'm sharing, and then there's a second round, right? For full-time positions, there's usually a second round, and in that second round, it includes, that's usually an administrative team, right? So it's usually the dean of that department, the vice president, you know, associated with that area, and then the president of the college, right? So it's typically a 3 to 4 person committee, and that's the second round, right? At that point, there's typically no faculty in that committee. It's an administrative committee. So two rounds of interviews, and then, you know, a 3-tier, you know, screening process. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. All right. Any other questions so far on this part, everybody, before we jump into some of the other stuff? And again, feel free to, you know, stop me and ask questions as I keep going, because I think that's, you know, a lot more informative, you know, when I'm actually able to jump into some of the details based on your questions.
Jesus,
Yes.
This is David Munoz. I posted this in the chat, but since we're all chatting, I figure I'll just ask. So when looking at the posting of the position, when you were saying that questions are derived from the job description,
Yes.
is job description the same as the position summary, or which part of the actual recruiting document should we be looking at for that?
Yeah, so that is the typical responsibilities, I think, right? Like, because if you look at the job posting, right, there'll be like a summary, but then there's also like a typical duties or responsibilities, right? Like that sort of bullet point list, I think,
Got
is the
it.
one that lends itself to generate the screening criteria and then the questions. Yeah, not so much like the institutional summary or the general description. I think is looking more at those bullet points. And I would go through all of the bullet points, everybody, because sometimes at the end of the bullet points may be some of the parts that particular position is tailored for, right? So what I mean by that is, when I applied for my position, it was a general English faculty position. But then if you kept reading, at the end, there was like one bullet point that talked about how that position was for the Puente project, right? And so, I think a lot of folks, if you're interviewing for a position that has a particular emphasis, then you'd want to be familiar with like the Puente project, right? And what does that project do, and who does it serve, and what are the goals, right? So I would go through all those bullet points to make sure that at the end of that list, because at the very top is probably going to be the general position, and then probably at the end there might be some of the unique specific details that are for that position. Right? So I'll review all of those bullet points. But thank you for that question to help us clarify. Does that answer the question? Getting a thumbs up, so I'm assuming yes. All right, everybody. So let's go now to the structure, okay, of the interview for folks that have never had a chance to interview with Los Rios. Again, it's a very formal process. It's standard, across positions. It was generally standard across positions, and what I've noticed, there are some positions that don't require a writing sample, but generally speaking, there's a pre-interview process, right? There's a couple phases in the pre-interview, and then there's the actual interview, right? So before the interview, typically there will be some writing sample, right? So again, depending on the department, some departments may say, nah, or the search committee may say, we don't really need a writing sample for this. We don't need to check the candidates' writing skills. We're happy to skip it, right? But most of the ones that I've served on did have a writing sample, right? And that what happens is you show up to your interview. You're not given the prompt ahead of time, right? You show up, you're given a prompt, and then you're given about 20 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes to write about a particular topic. Typically, when I've served on search committees, the writing prompt is just a question that the committee came up with that had so much, detail or complexities about it that the committee said, "Oh, that's a good writing sample question," right? Like we want the candidates to fully think that question through, and we want them to, have some time to fully, again, think the question through, write about it, revise their answers, right? So typically, the writing sample is a question that the committee came up with, right, when they were coming up with those questions, but decided we want more thought in this question. So, and again, the prompt from the writing sample, like all the other interview questions, is probably going to come from, it's not probably, it has to come from the job description, right? So they can't just come up with, they can't use, their own creativity to come up with their, it's not a psychological test. It's certainly not a grammar or, syntax and diction type of evaluation. Is more than anything, again, a question that they're expecting more, a different type of answer to, right? A more thoughtful answer to. So that's what happens to everybody. And then typically, if there is a writing sample, it typically also gets scored like an interview question, right? So on the committees that I've served on, when there was a writing sample, right? Like the writing sample, we will get the person's writing sample at the end of their interview, and then we would spend some time looking at the writing sample and would evaluate it like we would an interview question, right? So that's been my experience. That's been, I think that's a fairly typical part of the process. So that's the writing sample. Are there any questions on the writing sample before, as I keep going? I'm not in favor of it. I'll be honest. Maybe that's just because I'm an English faculty member and I like spend a bunch of time researching, timed writing and all that kind of stuff. But it is a part of it is a tool that the committee can use when in their search. Yes, there's a question by Andrew.
Yeah, can you give examples of the kinds of writing questions they might give from the job description? Like what did you experience?
Yeah, I can't remember my actual. I can't remember my actual question, but the writing sample, I'm trying to think of like this wasn't about this wasn't for a faculty, I'm trying to think of like the ones that stood out to me that were either like really good or really bad. And they tend to be about, they either tend to be like around, data or equity, right? Like they equity, equity questions tend to be good writing sample questions, right? Because the committee wants to kind of like, understand your thought process around equity, right? And equity issues, right? So I could see a lot of committees, reserving the equity question for a writing sample because they may want to see more of an in-depth answer, right?
About what I expected. Thanks for the confirmation. That's what
that's
what I would hope they
yeah.
would ask. Yeah, cool.
Yep. And then like some of the coordinating positions, it was more around like data analysis. You know what I mean? Where they wanted to see that how the candidates were going to process data that they had access to. There was another question.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, hi, everyone. My name is Jackie Vargas Oñate. I'm also counseling faculty. Sorry. But I would echo what Jesus just said. It mainly around equity. We want to see what happens when you dive in further. And sometimes I've even seen scenarios as a counselor where we want to see like what your train of thought is for certain scenarios with our student, where you get to demonstrate equity or your knowledge of data and how the college processes things on a larger scale sometimes.
So yeah, so those are the kind of, those are pretty, I feel like those are standard writing, or they become more standard writing questions, right? Around some of the institutional goals, right? Like equity that we're pursuing. Any other questions, everybody? Thank you, Jackie, for the feedback as well. Okay, so after you've written, your question, it could happen either while you're still in that, while you're still waiting to enter the interview space, or it can happen once you enter the interview space, but you're generally given some time to review the questions, right? So you're not, you don't walk into the interview and then get started right away, right? Like the committee gives you about somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes to review the questions, take some notes, right? The process is not to catch you off guard, right? Like the intent is not to catch you off guard and see how you respond under stress and stuff like that. No, we want you to think about how you're going to respond to this. We want you to gather your thoughts, maybe collect some evidence within your own reference, right? Within your own references, within your own experiences. And so that when we actually do ask these questions, you have substantive answers to offer. So that is, I wish somebody would have told me that before preparing for the interview, because then I would have, I feel like no matter what, I was going to be, anxious and stressed, and nervous. But then at least I could have, calmed myself during those 10 minutes, right? Of saying like, okay, I know I can expect the questions. I know I'm going to have some time, right, to gather, some concrete evidence for each of these questions, right? Especially from my own experiences, right? So that's it. I want to make sure that I highlight that because I think that is important to recognize. There's a question from Tara.
Hi, So when I'm a part-time instructor at
Mhm.
for Folsom Lake College, and I interviewed on Zoom since I've been recently hired. And I know I had my note cards and I kind of prepared of what questions I thought that they were going to ask, and so I could kind of look through my notes. But I was curious of how it would work being in person, and kind of, would we be allowed to kind of bring notes
Yep.
with us, or only what we could
Yes.
prepare once we get the questions?
No, thank you. That's a great question. No, you can show up with as many notes as you want, right? So there is no yeah, there is no limitation. You could I mean, I've seen, I've seen candidates show up with, notes that, things that they wanted to be sure they could, they could highlight in their, in their oral presentation, right? And when you're under so much, stress, anxiety, and all these other, all these ideas just jumping at you at one time, I think it serves, right, to have, some notes, something visual to remind you of, a particular experience. And we'll talk about that a little bit towards the end, but I mean, since we're already here, I always tell people, jot down at least three like experiences that you've had that you can jump into at any given moment, right? Like regardless of the question, you know what I mean? Like like something that really highlights your strength, to have at least three of those stories ready to jump into, so that you could, articulate your strengths as a faculty member. And so again, if I had to do it, if I was going to go through it again, I would just have my notes with those stories, maybe not the full story written out, but at least just like, the time I wrote that grant, or I supported with this effort, those kind of things. Janelle, you had a question?
Yeah, this is maybe kind of a silly question, but when they give you the questions for the interview, the list of questions, are they written in the same order that they will be asked in the interview?
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So again, like, this is Los Reels is really, the process is significantly formal, right? So in standard, right? So yes, they will be, the questions will be presented to you generally in the same order that they're going to be asked. Yeah.
I've heard some different tips about like writing on note cards, and then you can rearrange the note cards in the same order as the questions in the list. So that seems like a good idea. And then also I was wondering about if most interviews are starting to be given in person now, or if they are.
Not that I know of. The committees that I'm serving on, they're still, online.
Interviewing online.
Yes.
Okay.
So I think that's probably going to be, I mean, each search committee can decide on that, but I would assume that that would still be happening, through Zoom.
Okay. Just wondering about that. Yeah. To know what to.
Yeah, makes a big difference. Makes a big difference.
It does.
All right. So let me keep going, everybody, and go into the actual what happens during the interview, right? So during the interview, again, this is super like a very formal. Thank you. Can I ask everyone to? Thank you. So during the interview process, again, this is, sorry, I feel like now I feel like I'm being interviewed and getting all nervous. It's formal in the sense that it's not back and forth, right? So it's not a dialogue type of format, right? There's no back and forth. It's not like they ask you something, you start talking, and then they, interrupt with another follow-up question, and it's not like that. It's they have the questions pre-written, right? You're shown the questions, right? And then they'll ask you those questions in that same order, right? Now, usually, again, depending on the size of the committee, but typically every member of the committee gets to ask a question, right? And so, I mean, unless there's like, 15 members and there's only 7 questions, then only 7 members will ask a question. And the rest of the committee will just, sit there and take notes. And so that's what, you know, that's a pretty standard form of the interview. There are some parts of the interview that are typical. They're not required. Like the presentation, there's typically, you know, there'll be a presentation question where they'll ask you, you know, this can be kind of like a teaching demonstration, right? If you're an instructional faculty, right? They might say, hey, can you, you know, present on, like for me, it was do a quick teaching presentation on how to summarize, you know, a text, right? And so, you know, I had to teach you know, do like a 10-minute teaching it wasn't 10 minutes, like 5 to 7 minutes teaching presentation. If it's not instructional faculty, they might say, you know, like, can you present to, you know, there's can you present to in a professional development session, if you're a counselor, present to, you know, math faculty, for instance, that this is going on. So that's the kind of presentation that I'm talking about. So there's two questions, David, and then Professor Q. But we'll start with David, and then we'll jump over.
Yeah, thanks again for doing this. So with regards to the questions and asking them in order, let's say we work through all of the questions, but, you know, by the time a candidate gets to, you know, near the end and there's still time left in the interview, they recall an experience or some additional information that they would like to add to a prior question. Is that something that they can go back to?
Yes. So if you guys don't mind muting yourselves. Someone still that's not unmuted. Can everyone please mute their mic? Sorry, everyone. Okay, there we go. Thank you. So yes, the question was, if you go through the interview process, you answer all the questions, you still have time, can you come back? Yes, that was actually going to be one of the tips that I share with folks, is that, you know, the way that the instructions of the committee are given is that, you know, if you find answers, if the candidate responds to a question, either in another question or at the end, you can still use that answer, right, to give them credit, right? So the interview committee can only give you credit on information that you provide, right? So that's actually like significantly important, because, you know, if you're, let's say, a part-timer, right, and you work with your, you know, the members of the committee are your colleagues, and let's say that you collaborated on a project, right? And so you're like, okay, well, you know, I know that, you know, so-and-so has seen me do this, so I don't need to bring it up because they already know. Nope, no good. Because they can't use outside knowledge to evaluate your interview, right? So they can only use what you present during that interview time period, right? If somebody presents information that's outside of what you presented, either the equity rep or the chair would put a halt to that, you know what I mean? Would say like, no, you can't use that, you know what I mean? You can't use your relationship with that person to give them an unfair advantage, right? So the candidate, we can only use what the candidate provides. So the candidate has to, you know, is giving us, you know, the material that we can evaluate. So if you run out, let's say you're speaking again, you know, you're nervous and you move on to the next question, but then as you're talking, you remember, oh, I remember what I was going to say about that. You could in that moment say, oh, you know what, you know, or maybe as you finish that question, right? As you finish your answer to that question, you can say, I'd like to also go back to question 3 and then, you know, finish your question. You can finish that answer in that time period, or you can, you know, get to the end, wait to the end, and then, you know, bring up that response at the very end, because at the end you're going to be asked, you know, if there's anything else that you'd like to share with us. So that is the time where you can, you know, come back to questions. Does that answer your question, David? Okay, there was another hand that was raised. I believe it was Professor Q. Is the name?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry. I ended up changing my name to my actual name, Lakeisha. I forget that
Okay,
it's
Lakeisha,
Professor Q.
I'm sorry. I was like, okay, I know I'm just gonna respect what's there, you know, and go with
Yeah.
Professor Q. Okay, Lakeisha, what's your
Sorry
how
about
can I
that.
help?
Thanks, Jesus.
Uh-huh.
I am applying to non-instructional faculty positions.
Mhm.
And because we are interviewing online, and because I know that you have experience on hiring committees, what do you think about creating a video so that you don't go over? Because they usually give us like 15 minutes to do this entire presentation. And I worry about going over time. And so, what if we create like a video that speaks exactly to that? Do you think that would be fine, like from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Right, because it's a presentation regardless
Yeah.
of if it's
Yeah,
recorded or not.
and we're typically not looking for like we're looking for, you know, awareness of the material, right? Like, you know, if it's a presentation, especially like let's say, you know, you're a counseling faculty, right, and you're presenting to like, you know, another branch of student services about a change, right? What we're looking for is, you know, your, you know, awareness of that content, right? And then we're looking at, but I think there's also like there is an element of like presenting, right? That that goes with that. But if it's recorded and we're still seeing a version of your, you know, of your presentation, um, shouldn't matter. That's a great question, and I wish I had, you know, the power to say yes, absolutely. But you know what, I would if I would ask that to the when you're called, you know, like if that committee would be okay with that, you know, because every committee is going to be, you know, it's probably going to be different unless they make a policy change, right? It's probably going to be up for the committee. That's a great question. I'm happy to bring that up to, you know, folks that I've worked with, whether it's at the union level, or, you know, with local, you know, at least the admin that I'm familiar with that I can ask.
Thanks, Jesus.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think it was Tara and then Kurandir.
Thank you. My question is, if we don't quite have time, or maybe we forget to say something during the Zoom or in-person interview, but it's been noted in the application file we previously submitted, that will be taken into account as well, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
If it's
there
like
usually
in the
is.
cover letter or under like committees we've served on, so they will know, they'll be able to take that into account since it's part of the actual application in itself and the interview.
Let me sort of like think that through as a, you know, if I was in an actual committee and that came up. Yes, they do have the right to do it, but whether or not they're going to actually look for that, you know what I mean, like those answers is a different question. Because when we sit there in the interview committee, right, we're giving your packet, right? So we have your packet in front of us. We have all of your materials, and so we could use, you know, your materials as well as the information that you're providing to us. But that's asking the committee, each committee member, right, to have that sort of intentionality so they can use it. Now, whether they would use it or not, that's a different you know, that's a different
Right.
question.
So it's best to
it's
say it in the
available.
interview, but it may not necessarily mean that everyone is that familiar with the application you've submitted.
Yep.
Is that fair to say?
Yep,
Okay.
that's fair to say.
Thank you.
And so that's why I would try to be, you know, be as vocal as I could. And also, if you get nervous, folks, and I know we're jumping now into some of the tips. If you feel like you're running out of things to say and you want to be conscious of time, feel free to, you know, say, you know, okay, you know, this as far as like, you know, I don't know how you would say that without feeling, you know, embarrassed, but feel free to cut yourself off. And then once you catch your breath, you know, and you have more to say, you can say it again at the end of the questions, right? There's always going to be that time to come back to questions at the end. So don't, you know, if you feel yourself just kind of like going on and on without really saying anything substantive, or what I would say is, if you, again, sitting on the, thinking about myself from a committee member, if you see the committee is stop writing, right? Because we're usually writing notes, right? Or typing, and that's kind of hard to do over Zoom. But if you're doing an in-person interview and the committee members stop writing, you might think, okay, they've heard what they needed to hear. I can move on to the next question. There's another question, Karen Deer.
So sorry, this is Gurinder. My question is, for in-person interviews, do they share the presentation topics beforehand, or
Yeah,
they
the
will be-
presentation topics, yes, you will have a knowledge of the presentation topics ahead of time. So again, when I applied and I had to, do a quick teaching lessons on like summaries, I was given that, the general topic. I mean, yeah, the topic itself, it's given to you. So yeah, you have, ways to prepare for that. There's another type of thing that another type of like presentation or part of the interview that's not just a straight up question, and that's the scenario. And oftentimes the committee will say, hey, imagine this scenario, right? A student walked in and this happened, right? Or you're dealing with this kind of student, or you're dealing with this, with this context. How would you respond to that? So that's also a very typical type of question. That one they won't give you ahead of time, right? So the presentation they'll definitely offer, but the scenario is typically not given to you ahead of time. They're given to you as a question, right? When you're being offered the interview questions, but not before you walk into the interview. Somebody said, when do we get these topics? And said, yeah, so the topic for the presentation, you'll probably be given when you schedule the interview, right? And then the scenario you'll be given when you're given the interview questions. Yep. So those are the three type of the three type of questions you can expect. Just a straight up question, right? A presentation, and then a scenario question. Those I think are the most common. They're at least they've been pretty standard in all the committees that I've served on. So some standard questions. These are questions that you can certainly anticipate everybody. The opening, I feel like the opening is the same, right? And the goal of the opening question, really, I've heard this be vocalized, is really to give you an opportunity to kind of like catch your breath, right? Articulate your strengths, right? And just, get comfortable in the situation, right? So, and generally is the same question, right? What makes you uniquely qualified for this position, right? Or why do you want to work here? Or what part, of your educational or professional experience has led you here? Or, pretty much a question about your qualifications, right? So that's if you can anticipate that kind of question, right? Then, preparing for that question is, relatively easier than some of the other questions, right? You can start to think about, do you want to focus on your academic experience, on some of your personal experiences, right? A lot of folks that I was hired with, or folks that were my peers, as college students and grad students and community college students, especially if you have community college experience as a student, right? Feel free to bring that up. I've always seen that get like a thumbs up, right? Like if folks come from the community college experience and they talk about that as a way to verbally document their connection to the system, I would not shy away from that, right? I would highlight that. So that's the very standard question that you can anticipate. Another more standard question that I think you can probably anticipate is an equity question, right? So whether that's the writing sample, or oral question, you can certainly anticipate that there's going to be a question about equity in the interview process. The closing, right? So as we were mentioning, it usually, this sounds pretty much every closing question that I've seen. You know, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about yourself? You know, take this opportunity to express either your interest in the position or your commitment. So this is where I would recommend folks, given our structure, is because it's not going to be a dialogue, right? If you do have questions about the position, this is just an opinion here. This is my 2 cents. A lot of the members in the committee aren't able to answer your questions, right? Maybe the chair, you know, maybe, but I haven't seen like that strategy, you know, do a lot for folks where they ask questions and then the chair, you know, usually the chair will just say, you know, I don't know, give a very generic answer. If you have more questions about the position, you know, I would kind of reserve those for, you know, like HR, right? Like, or the district officials, you know what I mean? Like I would save those questions for that part of the process, right? The last question I would use to, again, highlight anything that you haven't highlighted already. If you forgot something that you wanted to say, you know, use that as an opportunity to say it. If you come in, you know, with some evidence of your strengths, you know, preloaded, right? Like I said, if you come in with notes of, you know, these 3 stories or 3, you know, experiences that you really want to highlight, and you haven't gotten to those yet, use this as an opportunity to tell them about those experiences, you know? So you know, it's unfortunate that not a lot of people use that, right? And I think it's because they don't know that they can still talk about the other questions, right? Now, in all fairness, that last question is typically not weighed, right? So that means that you're not getting points for that question. But if your answering or your response to that question is applicable to the other questions, then you can increase your scores in the other questions. I hope that makes sense. I'll get to a question, Andrew.
Yeah, would it be worthwhile or acceptable to bring in previous like faculty peer reviews that I've had in classes at ARC or other institutions at that point? It's not required in the application, it's not even asked for, but like that seems like something that might be relevant.
If you want to reference it in your discussion, right, you certainly can. But in terms of like handing them out, you know what I mean, like to the committee, is not gonna. I haven't seen it be used in that way, and I don't know if it even can, you know, how it can be used. I might bring them as a reference point, you know what I mean? Like if as you're sharing, you know, you could say, you know, and as you know, I have here my previous evaluation, and you know, one of the strengths that one of my colleagues has highlighted is so and so, right? So that you can articulate it. And I think, you know, I mean, from a sort of like rhetorical perspective, I think it certainly can help your credibility, right? If you're coming in with those, you know, with those notes and then referencing them. But I'm not sure that actually passing them out, handing them out, I don't know how the committee would feel about using that, right? As they evaluate your response to the questions. Does that make sense?
Thanks.
Yeah, it's weird that we don't use it, right? Like we do that to evaluate part-time folk, but then we don't use that in the full-time part of it. You know? So,
yeah, a little weird, but
yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah. So again, closing. I would not waste that opportunity, everybody, to again, you know, highlight your strengths and your skills. And then you can anticipate, you know, a discipline specific, you know, or educational philosophy question, right? As you see here. And then again, you can anticipate, you know, more likely in a scenario, if you're instructional, if you're an instructional faculty, that they'll throw a sort of classroom scenario, right? What happens with this type of student, or what happens when, you know, when this, you know, things of that, you know, scenario driven things. So I want to jump now to just some basic, you know, tips that we've already kind of discussed. One, obviously, is to be specific, right? Like the things that I've noticed that helps candidates is that when they're specific, like when they're talking about, you know, this time this happened, or, you know, I had this instance, or, you know, I learned from doing this, you know, when folks speak from actual experiences, right? Like it's received with more, is received a lot better than when folks are just theorizing, right, about what they know and their education, or so I know. With that, having said that, and this was something that was offered to me when I was applying, but my mentors is have 3 stories that you're ready to jump into at any given time, right? So I would offer that to folks in this workshop as well. Keep three anecdotal pieces of evidence, right? So 3 stories, 3 projects that you worked on. Just have them ready to go at any given moment, because it's likely that the questions are going to be around that, right? And even sometimes, if I could be 100% honest here, is like, even if it's unrelated, right? If you just answer the question and you come at it and you share an experience, folks are probably going to still give you credit for that, right? Like because you're sharing an actual experience, right? Or you're speaking with evidence. And again, you can't assume that just because especially if you're a part-timer, in one of our colleges, and you have collaborated with your peers, and those peers are now in a committee, you cannot assume that just because you've collaborated with them that they're going to use that knowledge to evaluate you. They actually can't, right? So even though it sounds redundant, be sure to articulate and not assume that they will. Yeah, we talked about, at the end of the interview, using that time, right? And then the last part is which oh man, we are moving away from this culture, everybody, but still, I think I still, it's unfortunate that the formal nature of the process can make folks feel that they're not that they're not, I don't know, that they're not coming off as well. You know what I mean? And when I say formal nature, is like, when I sit on the interview committee, I want to write down this is how I feel. I'm like, as a committee member, I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to potentially do something in the committee that can, potentially ruin somebody's chances, right? So, and a lot of the committee members have that same sort of sentiment, right? Like they want to do the best because they don't want to be like the one person that gets called out for, giving somebody an unfair chance or something like that, right? So, or potentially discipline in some other kind of way. I haven't actually seen it, but that's how I think committed the committee members are to making sure that they're on their P's and Q's. And so we're often writing as many notes as we possibly can, right? And we're trying to be focus on the committee, on the candidate. So I think that part of it makes for very uninviting faces, right? Like I know, I only know because I've seen myself, like my thinking face looks like I'm mad, right? Like my writing like this looks like I'm upset with the response, right? And so that's something that, again, I wish somebody would have just told me to say, folks, folks are not gonna be, smiling and happy. You know what I mean? Like they're, just go in there and talk about your strengths and your highlights, and from then on, don't take it personal, right? That's the other thing. The other thing that I would say is, I was recommended, by some of my mentorship, to write a thank you email, right? Just to kind of, be a part, just to kind of like practice that, I guess that gesture. You feel free to write it, but I would say that, it can be used, by the time that you write that, by the time the committee member reads their email and that note that you gave them, their scores were already submitted. So it's not going to impact your score, but I think it does, it just kind of highlights, your awareness of the context, right? And the gestures of that context. Yeah, are there any questions? Yes. Tara, I'm sorry. I just assumed that you saw my eyes look over in that direction. But Tara, yes, can you have a question?
Yes, I know. I'm sorry. I have so many questions. This is the first kind of info session I've gone to, and it's so interesting. My question is, I graduated from grad school a few years ago now, and always my question is about the letters of recommendation. Since it's been a few years since I've been kind of in a student position, I've been teaching for about 5 years, and I teach part-time at different colleges. I'm never really sure what is an accepted person to ask for a letter of recommendation, besides old professors, and now it's getting, further away. I want to make sure they're still recent and somebody who knows me well, but who would be the next best people to ask from?
I would, to sort of like, echo maybe a little bit of, what Andrew brought up earlier, if you've been evaluated, right, by a, by a colleague, a peer, right, and they said, flattering things, or you have a relationship with a peer, right, and they've seen you teach, right, I would certainly think that that's valuable, right, because they're speaking to your teaching, right, potentially the chair of your department or the dean, right, if they visited your classroom, or have seen, just have some awareness of your teaching. I think they would be good candidates for asking, to ask for that letter. Faculty member, a previous instructor for sure, like a previous professor, but somebody that can speak to your, if you're an instructional faculty, right, somebody that can speak to your teaching, or if you're not instructional, if you're in counseling, somebody that can speak to your counseling. Does that make sense, Sarah? So you don't have to think of just like, okay, I have to get like the president of the college, right, or the president, or what I mean, like somebody that can just speak to what you can do.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Monique, you had a question, and then we'll move around to Robert and David.
Hey, thanks for doing this. Actually just found out I have an interview this month.
Nice.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Tenure track and all of that. And I've actually been on a few over the years. I've actually made it to the second level and almost gotten it. And, it's been a bit frustrating. And this is my first one since COVID. And one of the things I'm remember, because I just got the call 2 days ago, and I'm remembering, oh my God, I used to prepare for this, and I have to do this all again. And one of the things for me, I think that was the hardest part of it was staying organized. I make a lot of notes. I study them. I try so hard to narrow them down to like really basic bullet points and have them at the ready at the table. But it's easy to just feel a bit overwhelmed at all that could be thrown at you. And then just being able to super focus in to be able to answer your question in a well-articulated way. So if you have any advice on how to tackle that part of it, that's where I've stumbled in the past.
I think I don't know how helpful this is going to be, but if you can anticipate that you're going to have, 5 to 10 minutes, right, to review the questions, I would say, have a strategy for that time, right? Okay, that's going to be maybe when you're going, at least I would be just going, just my hair would stand up probably during that, 5 to 10 minutes, right? Of just like, okay, looking at my notes, trying to be organized, you know what I mean? Like presenting that, letting myself be a little overboard or a little over anxious during that time, just so that when I step in, I can catch, I can catch my breath, right? I know that the first question is going to be, I can prepare for the first question and just not, kind of use that first question to, let myself relax a little bit, right? So maybe, but obviously to everybody's, different, capacities, right? But, for myself, that's something that I think I would do. I would say, okay, I know I got 10 minutes to go kind of loony and just, scramble to look for, look through my notes and prepare some responses. And then right after that, I'm going to go in and I'm going to have 5 minutes of a more relaxed version of that, right? Of just like, I'm going to talk about myself and my strengths. And then I can kind of like rev back up, right? So I would,
yeah. And one more quick question. I was giving my teaching demonstration topic, and it actually pertains to like sort of how I would modify due to COVID, how I would teach something in the context of COVID. And I guess my question about that is when I'm doing a teaching demonstration, how much of it are they weighing like my skill in terms of delivery and how good the presentation looks versus content?
It's probably a little bit more. I mean, each committee member is going to be different, right? They have, they have the right and freedom to interpret, your response differently. There's no standard, there's no standard interpretation of that response. But at least in my experience, it tends to be more around interpretation. More around presentation than around content, right? Like, because you'll have a content specific question where they'll be able to measure your awareness of the content or the skill that you're teaching. But the teaching presentation is probably going to be much more around the actual teaching, right? Like, how do you
Gotcha. That's kind of what I thought, but okay. Yeah. But there was the nature of this question being sort of, it's a good question, it's a good demo question, on, how do I adjust things and present things in the days of COVID, like how does that modify my lecture and stuff? So, so I think it might be a little bit more content heavy, like where they're going to look at that a bit more, but okay. But what you said makes sense.
It's up to the committee member, right? Like not even the entire committee. It's up to each committee member to interpret that however they want to interpret that.
And I will say, to add on to what Jesus is saying, I just got hired on this last pool of full-time hires. And throughout the multiple interviews and second interviews is remembering not to take it personal. Sometimes they have to look for minuscule, and I'm talking about minimal differences between 2 to 3 candidates. So sometimes it's not even you, it's just like maybe they needed somebody that had this slight more expertise in a certain topic than what you had. So just remembering that. And then as far as anxiety, because of course I had a lot of it interviewing like we all do. I took the questions I would strategize like taking a test. So try to write examples for the easy ones first, because I knew I was going to spend less time on those, and then focus on the harder ones a little bit more. And when it came to the interview panel, I literally would stare at something in the wall. I've interviewed through Zoom as well before. And that I didn't even look at the panel. I legitimately just looked at the sticker that I had next to the camera, and that's all I looked at. In person, I stared at the clock behind the person that was in front of me asking the question, or a wall, right? That's all I stared at. Because of that. Because of the facial expressions, they're going to throw you off, because nobody's going to have a proper facial expression, and nobody's really staring at you in the face. Everyone's writing. So same thing, whatever, just for that, focus on other points that make you less nervous.
I've even given the suggestion to. I remember I was working with somebody that was preparing to interview, and I could tell that whenever she closed her eyes, she would focus more. And I mean, I just recommend, I say, just close your eyes. We're not judging you on, we can't evaluate you on that, we're evaluating you on the content. So if there are things that you can do that can help you be more focused and help you present, the best version of yourself, engage with those strategies. And actually, I do want to get to go ahead, Jackie.
Oh, Jesus just reminded me, you could always, if you're nervous, you could let the committee know ahead of time. Like I always cry in the first question because I remember everybody that supported me. So I let the committee members know, like, hey, I'm gonna cry. It's okay. I'm okay. Just letting you guys know. And then I go into it and then I cry. And that's normal too. So sometimes even letting them know what's about to happen so they're prepared for it will help lessen that anxiety as well. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of letting folks know I'm nervous, as I did earlier today. So, yes, feel free to articulate that. Robert, you had a question?
And you may have even kind of covered this, but in the position that I am currently applying for, they are not requesting, there's nowhere to put in a letter of recommendation. And I have those available to me from, a vice president of instruction in another district and my former dean of this legendary dean of the division that I'm working for. And apparently it's an equity issue now. Is that true?
It's not an equity issue. What it is that each committee gets to decide, there are all these different tools that they have at their disposal but they don't have to, they don't have to use all the tools, right? So
Okay.
they could say, we don't really we don't really care about letters of rec for this one.
Right.
Or they might say like, we don't really, care about a writing sample for this one. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
so those are the tools that they have at their disposal, but it's up to each committee.
Well, and I certainly know I'm reading your presentation materials. I certainly don't want to take the former nature of the process personal, but I almost feel like it's an equity issue that I can't use the letter of recommendation because I have letters of recommendation that basically say I walk on water and I can't use them. Do you think that a request for a letter of rec may come up if I actually get to the interview process? It may appear later.
What will come up is the reference check, right? Like if
certainly.
They will check your references, right? And so if some of those are the same people, then there will be that opportunity.
Yeah, maybe they just want to get right to that. Maybe that's what it is. So
it could be. Yeah.
That would be to the same end. So okay. Okay.
I don't know why that committee has that thought process. I remember sitting on a committee and just being like, we didn't get any letters of rec,
right.
And then just asking the chair afterwards, like, hey, did we not do that? And then sometimes I'll be honest and like, damn, it kind of sucks I don't be recorded. But sometimes they just forget. You know what I mean? Like they just oh shoot, forgot to click that box to request the letters of rec, and we just sort of focus on the resume and cover letter and that thing. So so I don't know what the strategy or was behind it or is behind it. That would just be an assumption.
Okay. Thank you.
Janelle, you had a question?
Yeah, so I was just wondering if you have any tips in particular for doing Zoom interviews. Like when you've been serving on an interview panel, has there been people that have done anything that was a big no-no?
No, again, in a Zoom it's even less, it matters less of like, the style, because folks are writing in this Excel sheet, right? Like we have an Excel sheet open while people are speaking, so I'm really not
focused on that Excel sheet.
I'm focused on the Excel sheet. I may not even have the Zoom window open, right? I'm just listening to content, which I think really sucks, because again, if I'm putting myself in the candidate's position, all I'm seeing is everybody staring down, right? Like avoid, not having their most pleasant face on because they're typing away. So I wouldn't focus too much on that. And typically what I'll say, and the other thing that I would say is if one of the perks of Zoom is that you can be comfortable in your space, right? Like you can make your space as comfortable as you want it, whatever that wherever it is that you work best. Obviously I wouldn't have too many distractions, right? Like I don't know, I probably wouldn't do a Zoom interview over at a coffee shop, right? Because there may be too many things. But if you're at home, again, the committee members, as long as they can hear you, right, and write notes, that's what they're going to be focusing on.
And what about the teaching interview through Zoom? I mean, should we? What looks good, as far as using like slide presentations? I mean, do they want to see more space? Do they want to see you writing on something?
No, they're probably not going to be able to do all that. Like, they may not focus on all the writing, right? Like watching you actually write on the board. I think it may be more of just like how much engagement is there, right? Like, is it interactive or are you just talking for 10 minutes? Right. So thank you for that question, because that will make a difference, right? If you just present for 10 minutes straight, they're going to be like, okay, this candidate has minimal student engagement, right? She's just going to be a lecturer, versus somebody that has, quick intro to an activity, and then, a mini lecture at the end to kind of, highlight the learning outcomes of that training. So I would focus on that more, like make it be a little bit more interactive if there is space for that. Chewy, you had a question, and I'm sorry.
Real quick, I know time's running out. Following up on Janelle's question on the presentation, how would it look if we ask for participation from the members while they're writing. I know that was an awkward thing that I did in the past. And I felt the reception wasn't the best because they had to put their pen down and actually engage. What are your thoughts on that?
I would prepare that sort of activity anticipating that they're not going to engage. You know what I mean? Just already assume, and then you feel free to say like, okay, what do you guys think about this? And then even if nobody's saying like, all right, well, that's a good idea. You know, you can, it's a presentation. It's a, you know, you're kind of doing like a, what do you call that? I mean, you're acting it out. You can,
Okay.
you can assume, you can like build in made up students and say like, okay, hey, thank you, Alex. That was a great question. Now, you know what I mean? You can do that. You'd have to be a little bit more creative, and I can see how that could be potentially a little embarrassing, but I would just automatically assume that they're not going to participate and build in your own sort of participation,
Okay.
right? Or just skip over that quickly, right? Like maybe in the real class, you would, you know, do 10-minute activity. Here, is just, you know, all right, and then you can just tell them, okay, assuming that the students did the activity, now I would be returning to this other part.
Okay, awesome. And then one last question real quick. The president's interview, is it always structured with the president and a VPI?
Typically, that's what I've seen. You know, it's usually those three levels, right? So the dean, either the AVP or VP, and then the president. For full-time, you know, tenure track positions, it is usually those three levels of senior management.
I got to participate in that once and didn't get the job. And so any tips on that?
That, you know, that's a lot less formal. That there's really no, the only ones that I participate in has been my own, and then also just from hearing different people. But that interview, it really is much more dialogue, right? So it's more like, you know, they might ask follow-up questions, right? It's not as structured as the first round. So it's kind of hard.
If I might,
Yeah.
I had a complete opposite experience as that when I was on a second level interview, and it ruined me. It ruined it. I was prepared for a very casual scenario with like me and the president and maybe one other person. I walked in there, it was a round table, a full committee with structured questions. And this was here in California. So it wasn't like it was another state where things are done differently. And I walked out of there just in tears because I was not prepared. Emotionally, you know what I mean? Like I was ready for something a lot more relaxed, and it was a grilling. So yeah, that's just my experience. So
yeah, so different. Yeah, that part of the question, it just seems, I mean, that part of the process tends to be a lot more context based, right? I think the first tier is very standard, it's very generic, and then the second part is just up for grabs. So I wish I had more, you know, more insight. Maybe we'll get an administrator to show up on one of the follow-up workshops that we do. I do want to get to other.
Thank you both. Appreciate it.
Elsa, did you have a question?
Yeah, I actually had a few questions, and one of them was what you were just talking about the finalist interview. Since I've done a number of interviews already, and pretty much with one exception have always been a finalist, but then never got offered the job. And I guess I've heard the same response from you when I've asked other faculty is like, well, we don't know, you know, we're not there. That's the president. So anyway, thank you for addressing that. In terms of interviewing, I have some questions about Los Rios and the Los Rios timing, because I've already done one interview in another district. And I have 2 more scheduled for this month. For positions that closed in Los Rios in early March, when would they be doing interviews? Would this be before or after spring break? You know, just as I think about how I'm allocating my time and when interviews might be happening, how long does it take from closure to actually doing the interviews?
Right. So, I mean, they close the position, you know, typically the position closes and then the committee's assembled, right? So, I mean, that gives you an idea of the time period, right? So it's not like the committee's assembled as the people are applying. At least in my experience, I want to say that's standard. I'm not sure, but that's how it feels like. They close the position, and then the committee is assembled to generate the screening and the questions, right? And then once that's developed, then they release the pool of candidates to the committee so they can screen candidates, right? And then they have to, you know, submit the candidates to, you know, whoever it is that calls the candidates. So there's, yeah, you know, that's a, you know, after
I mean,
closing, it's
there
probably
were-
about a month or two.
Yeah,
between-
so positions in the district that closed on March 9th, you think they would probably interview after spring break?
Probably, because if they closed on March 9th, that means the committees probably got together this week, right? To start, and then depending on how quickly the committee moves, right? So, you know, I've been on some committees where we do the screening and the interview questions in the first meeting. And then I've been on other committees where we just do the screening the first meeting and then have another meeting for the questions and to identify the candidates. And then they're called, and then we, you know, so, you know, I would say probably about a month before, I mean, a month after the position closes, at least a month before, you know, before you can hear back. Yeah.
Okay.
Alicia, did you have a
Thank
question?
you.
Thank you, Elsa.
Hi, Jesus. Yeah, I was just thinking, I think you just touched on it, like, what does it look like? And maybe it was a few minutes late, like scoring of the questions, are they all the same? Like, can you receive the same amount of points for each question in the first round? And then what does it look like going to the second round? Like, how many people are like invited to the second round?
Yep.
And
So,
you just touched on the second round selection, you're not sure, but also, you
Yeah.
know,
that's a good question. Generally speaking, the questions are weighed the same, right? Generally speaking, but the committee has the right to decide that, right? So, like one of the committees that I've served on, they said, nope, this question right here is really important, so we're gonna weigh it, you know, or we're gonna weigh it more. So they have the right to do that, but generally speaking, they weigh them all. They weigh them all the same amount of points, except for the last one, right? Like the last one, they typically waive, right? And that's a more of a, it's not requirement. It's just they just say, well, because what if somebody doesn't have something to add? Does that mean that they get punished, right? So they'll waive the last. They won't score the last one, but again, you can use material from that question to up your score in some of the other ones. And so I think it's typically kind of like a, I don't know, the scale is either like 1 to 5 or like 1 to 10, right? And so then you're just scored on that. And there was a question that just came in. It was how many questions, and only because this relates, I'll put it in. Is, you know, generally speaking, about 6 to 7 questions, right? 6 to 7 questions. Typically, is you get about, you know, 40 minutes. For a full-time position is generally about, you know, 40 to 45 minutes, right? Assume, because it's like a whole hour. If you can kind of like think about it from the committee member, they want to, you know, use like hour chunks, right? So it's like 20 minutes for the written portion, and then like 40 minutes for the you know, oral interview. So Lisa, you had another question in there. I don't know if I got to it. Or how, oh, okay, this is actually important, everybody. How the individuals are selected. This is actually, dang, I wish I should have brought this up way earlier. Hopefully folks are still hanging out and listening to this. The committee members score their sheet, right? They score their sheet, they tally the scores, and then they rank every candidate, right? So who scored, you know, the highest scoring candidate will get a, you know, 1 of 8, let's say, right? And then, you know, they rank everybody, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then they submit that to the equity rep and the chair, right? And then the equity rep and the chair tally those numbers. And then they don't present the names, they just present the numbers. Okay, so then the committee just looks at like scores, right? Like, okay, this candidate without their name present, this candidate, or here are the scores. You know, this person got a, you know, here are, you know, 50, 49, 48, 46, so 50, 48, 49, 40, 49, 48, and then like, you know, 40, 39, 30, you know, usually what the committee is going to look for is that gap, right? Of like, are there 3 or 4 candidates that are score relatively high? and that's usually the practice is that, okay, we'll look for where we can see a visible gap, and so we can see, okay, these 4 candidates, obviously, outscored the rest, so maybe we can just send these 4, right? Sometimes that gap doesn't exist, right? And so there's more conversation. But that's important to highlight because the names are not present, right? So, sometimes folks, committee members will be like, well, we want to know who the candidates are so we can discuss each candidate, and then usually the equity rep, well, depending who the equity rep is, but at least when I've been the equity rep, like, no, we can't really, let's not release the names until we identify what the cutoff is. And then we can talk about, the strengths of the candidates and so on. And then we can argue, but maybe first we draw that line, right? So that's usually how it's drawn. And so I've been on committees that have, send up, as many, like everybody pretty much, like, because it was a small pool. So there was about like 5 people, 2 that, just were, no, I'm sorry, 1 that just did not do well. And then the rest, we just send up, we just say, let the second round make that decision. We can make the decision. We can come to agreement. So we'll let the second tier decide. But then we've also send up, like I remember one committee, we just send up 1 person. We just said, it's clear, it's obvious. You know what I mean? And I think here at the president at Sac City, used to open up the discussion saying, don't send anybody that you wouldn't want me to hire, right? And that was sort of his practice. And so we in that particular committee, we said, we really only think that this candidate is out of this pool, so we put it to him, either we open up the search again, or you interview that committee, that person. If you agree with us, then you hire them, and if not, then we open up the search again. So it ranges in outcomes, but that's the process. At least you're familiar with the process of how candidates are sent forward. Again, super formal and super kind of boring, because I thought it was going to be a lot more, I would hear these horror stories about like committees arguing over candidates and stuff like that. It just hasn't, at least it hasn't happened in any of, we get there, we see the numbers. After we see the names, we're like, let's talk about these candidates. But usually folks agree on the numbers. There was another question. Monique, did you have another question?
Yeah, it's me again. Really quick question. And, I think I already know the answer, but how many are typically chosen for the first round?
Depends on the committee and the position. I've seen as little as 4 to 5, and I've seen as many as, I remember one, it was like 2 days full of interviews, because it was but that one, it was because there was multiple positions. So I think we interviewed like 14 people, but there was multiple positions. So it ranges, but if it's a 1 position post, I would probably say a safe bet is somewhere between 5 and 8. Alicia, another question, or did you just leave your hand up? I think you just.
No, sorry. That's it. Thank you.
Any other questions, folks? I'm happy to, answer any other ways that we can, share it.
Hey, Suze, I'll ask one more.
Yeah, go for it.
Everyone else is done. So back to the letters of recommendation. So who are those reviewed by, and what are they trying to sort of determine by those? I guess that's my general question, because there's a multitude of people I would choose for a letter of recommendation, but I'm trying to tailor it.
Great question. Again, tailor their and I would share the job description to them and say, hey, this is what they're looking at, right? So they can potentially tailor, their recommendation based on those skills, because the letter of recommendation is reviewed by the committee when we're screening, right? And we're screening based on a criteria that is established from the job description. right? And so when we're screening, we can use your resume, your cover letter, your letters of recommendation, your transcript, like the whole application, whatever is required within the application, we can use all those tools to screen, right? So whether you list it in your resume or it shows up in your letters of recommendation, we can use that to, you know, award you points. So again, I would look at that at the job description, right, and then identify people that can speak to those type of, you know, typical responsibilities, and then even, you know, I would share that job description with, you know, with the person that I'm asking, you know, to say, hey, you know, I'm applying for this position, you know, would you mind speaking to my qualities as they regard to these roles and responsibilities.
Great, thank you.
Elsa?
To unmute. So I thought I have another question. So I know that this is not something that's permitted, but I wanted to ask you about age discrimination. And, you know, I know especially the first committee, there's a very first interview, there's like specific criteria and stuff that they're grading on. But, you know, as it goes on to the second committee and how much of a implicit bias there might be to somebody with gray hair, especially with a woman who has uncolored hair, you know, it's like, oh, I'm going to a professional interview, I better color my hair, or, you know, can you speak to that reality of that happening, even though it's not permitted?
Yeah, well, it's not only not permitted, right? Like, I mean, is like, I mean, you could have a, you know, substantial legal action that you could, you know, that you could pursue if you feel like that is happening. Probably, I mean, yeah, that, you know, that's what I would, the one thing that I would say is like, is there, you know, to be in this, in actually, you know, I don't know about the second round, so it's hard for me. I don't know if, you know, people at the second round have to go through these trainings, but I know for us at the first round, we have to go through all these trainings, right, that talk about, you know, implicit bias and all this kind of stuff to be able to serve on the committee. And then to be an equity rep, you have to go through even more, you know, more trainings. And so there's, yeah, I don't know how to, you know, but at the same time, is like, you know, if somebody has that, you know, has that bias in them, or, you know, I just don't know. Yeah, it's hard for me to speak to that, because I've seen it both. I can see the point, right, of like my gut instinct wants to say like, well, we, you know, I can see why people would have that tendency to say, no, we want faculty, you know, that can potentially be here for a long time or whatever. You know, I can see that kind of, I can see how that might pop into, you know, the thought process, right? But at the same time, like I said, like when, you know, when I was hired, you know, it was both, you know, like myself that was, you know, relatively, you know, new to the field, and then, you know, I was hired alongside somebody that had been a part-time, you know, for, you know, several years, and was actually, you know, is close to retirement. So, you know, she was hired as she was nearing her retirement. So it's kind of, yeah, I guess I'm saying that I have evidence of both, right? I don't know, Elsa. I don't know if I'm answering your. I know I'm not answering your question, but I don't know if this feedback is even as productive or not. I would just say that. Yeah, go ahead.
It's helpful to hear. Just, you know, I'm sure everybody individual has a different perspective, but you know, anyway, it's just helpful to hear some thoughts on that.
I would say that most of the people that I've served on committees are terrified of issues around liability and discrimination. You know what I mean? Which actually, you know, is a good thing, but it also makes it very formal, structure, and impersonable, right? So at least in my experiences, most folks that are on hiring committees at all levels are just like, man, I don't want this to come back and be the reason why, you know what I mean? Like I'm either, you know, pursued, you know, there's some sort of like legal issues pursued, or I am, you know, penalized because I've, you know, did something that was outside of the scope of the committee. You you know, there's a significant level of fear in the committee members to not be liable. That I can share honestly. I feel that I talk to people that are I'm friends with, cool, close. These are real friends, not just colleagues. And they, you know, we don't talk about, you know, stuff of that degree, you know, outside of the committee. You know what I mean? Even people that I know, like, I know you're my friend, but I mean, I still don't want to really talk about this because I'm concerned that for some odd reason, the conversation finds its way back out to somebody that can do something about it. I don't even know who would do that. You know what I mean? Like, I'm tenured. I think my job is secure, but I'm still super afraid of that happening. And I think that's a shared sentiment among committee members. Another questions, Chewy?
Oh, I was just wondering if I could share an experience. I also served in a committee once, and it was really obvious that one of the candidates, and I knew him personally, and this is for an industry position, and he went the route and colored his hair, and I could tell he was more nervous than usual, and he felt uncomfortable. And so, long story short, is he didn't get the position, and we later had discussions. And I asked him point blank, well, why did you do that? And he said, I was just trying to be more hip, more cool, you know, because the college wants to get some service out of me. And so I said, well, you know, and I shared my personal experience. I mean, this was like years after the interview, I ran into him, and I said, it just made you feel very uncomfortable. And so my 2 cents for whoever just asked that would be, if you're going to feel more comfortable or authentic with gray hair, I'd say rock it, because 2 cents. Gracias.
And it's likely that the person that the people that interview you, if it's that concerned, right, of like, you know, they're thinking of how long I have to be of service to the college. You know, what I've seen is most of those people are not at the same campus for more than 5 years. You know what I mean? So why would they even have that thought of like, no, I need to make sure that this is somebody that's going to be here for more than, you know, whatever amount of time. So I guess I'm saying that to echo the message of, you know, whatever your most authentic self is, or however it is that you feel most comfortable, that's going to do a lot more than, you know, overcompensating in any way. Other questions, folks? You know, we're definitely beyond time, but I'm happy to keep answering questions and offer as much insight as I could, you know, from my experiences. Yes. Adeline, I don't know how to pronounce the name. I'm so sorry.
It's
Adeline?
okay, Andeline, but I go by
Adeline.
Andy.
Andy, please.
Yeah, I was just reading the sample questions that I think I can't remember. I don't know. I think it was Jackie that shared with us. And there is a question that I remember some fellow faculty sharing with us, saying that it tripped them. It was this one: please describe how you may want to contribute to your department, college, and community outside your regular teaching duties. I know that we as full-time faculty, we have to serve in committees, so that wouldn't be a good answer, right? What are some other things that do you have any tips for that? Some other things that would sound like a good idea to share?
Yes. So first, I wanna demystify that you have to serve on a committee. I've never served on a committee, everybody. I'm saying so, but there is college service. So you're required to do college service, right? But college service can look in a wide variety of ways, right? So one of the things that you could do to give yourself some ideas, right, is if you, I don't know if you've seen the college service checklist, right? But there's, I'm sure you can probably Google it and it'll pop up. So like a Los Rios or Sax or whatever college, you know, the college that you're applying to, college service, right? Or college service hours. It's a standard checklist. It might be in the union website as well. But it's a checklist of all the different things that you could do, right? So be a part of be an advisor to student clubs, do type of like outreach, lead professional development, right? So there's a pretty extensive list of ways that you can contribute to the college. But to this question in particularly, and how you would how you could potentially generate some ideas as to way to answer it. It might be to ask some people in your department, like, what is, what's happening in the department, right? Like, are there any like specific needs, or are there any goals that the department is pursuing, right? So like, for instance, for in my department, when I applied, in English department, when I was applying, this is when AB 705 was barely rolling out, right? And so there was, I asked, colleagues that were not on the committee, because your colleagues on the committee will definitely not be able to talk to you about it. But colleagues that weren't on the committee, just kind of like, what's the direction, or that we're going towards. And I got some ideas out of that, because they said, probably going to be a co-requisite, and Carrie's teaching a co-requisite model that may be the model for the whole campus. And then I asked Carrie, I'm like, hey, can you tell me about
whatever you feel comfortable.
Correct your co-requisite model. And so that helped out.
The modules are broken.
Yeah. Oh no, somebody's mic is back on. Oh, there we go. So does that make sense, Andy? Doing a little bit of research with your colleagues, I think could really help out.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and also the website. You could also like visit the, like, if there's like a campus campus or department website to get some ideas. That could also help out. But I would recommend connecting with some peers that are not serving on the committee to see what the department needs, or what the direction of the department is, and then generating some thoughts around that.
Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions, folks? If not, I'll share my email. I'll put it in the chat. I am happy to keep the conversation going. Whether it's through email or another a phone call. This is I don't want to call it my passion, but this is what I wished I would have had when I was applying for jobs. You know what I mean? I feel like when I was applying for my job, for jobs, it was just so many myths out there. You know what I mean? Like I heard so many stories that just made the experience much more difficult than it had to be, right? Like people saying, oh, you got to do research, you got to be published. Like, oh my God, what a waste of thought. Because it is completely unrelated, to the community college faculty experience. Or I had people saying that you have to volunteer on committees to be like, nope, there was no discussion on that, right? It was just myth, you know what I mean? It's just like all these myths around how much free labor you have to give before you get a full-time job, or the idea that you have to be a part-timer for 10 years before you could apply, and you got to earn your due. Again, total myth. I had 3 semesters of part-time before I applied and got my full-time job, and I'm so happy that I didn't listen to those myths. You know what I mean? Because otherwise I would have just kept telling myself not to apply for those jobs. So any way that I can help.
I was told that too.
Yeah. So it's not
you
true.
have so many.
Yeah. And then same thing with the idea that if a committee already told you no, then it's over. They don't want you. Nope, because it's a new committee every time, right? So the same. If you already didn't get a second interview from one group, that's not going to be the same group that interviews you the second time. It's a new committee every time. So, Kevin, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to ask a quick question. I want to apologize because I have you in one ear and I had to take a call from my other position in my other ear. And I'm being completely transparent about it because I was wondering, are you open to any consultation and conversation at all outside of this?
Yeah, heck yeah. So I love doing this. I love talking about this, and I love sharing as much as I possibly can about the process. Obviously, I'm not comfortable stepping in outside of any bounds, but giving people like, oh, this person did this. I'm happy to share as much insight, as I can, and just keep sharing, because I think the more people know about the process, the less scary it is. And it really isn't. It's a super formal process. completely independent of the private sector, right? This is, what happens in actual industry and in the private sector is so significantly different than this process, right? So.
Yeah, it's I'll just disclose. So I actually come from the chancellor's office. And so I worked on many a committee and did many a thing and have learned quite a bit. But I've also tried for 10 years to get to the point where I'm in adjunct. And so just some questions I had that I'm not comfortable talking in front of a group about just because of the position I had previous. And so I very much appreciate if you had any time, maybe even just 15, 20 minutes.
Yep. I shared my my email in the chat. If you want to send me an email, and then we can get on the phone. You can send me an email, and then when I'll reply with my phone number and we can get on the phone. I'm happy to.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yep.
I appreciate
Jacob,
that.
No problem. Jacob, you have a question as well?
Yeah, and you kind of touched on it a little, or at least hinted at it. So thank you for the workshop, but I'm a new adjunct. I taught my first community college courses in August. I was in high school and K through 12 before that. When is it viable for me to look at full-time positions? I was also told that it would take a few years, that I should wait a certain amount of time and gather a certain amount of experience. And I want to be at least competitive when I'm applying. I don't want to be applying and everyone there has been here for 10 years.
Thanks, man. That's a great question, Jacob. I would say apply now, and here's why. One, as an equity rep, whenever I sit on the committee as an equity rep, it's my job to make sure that the questions that we generate and the screening criteria that we generate is not tailored to favor only people with community college experience, right? So we're very intentional about making sure that people's experience from the private sector, from K-12, from the K-12 sector, from 4-year institutions could be valued in the screening and in the interview process, right? And I know it's not just me, right? That's the training that we all go through, right? And usually it's not even, I'm not even the one catching it, right? It'll be like the department chair that says, okay, that's a great question, but let's take out higher education. You know what I mean? Like they'll say, talk about your experience, and instead of saying like across, departments in higher ed, they'll just say, okay, across maybe departments or institutions, right? So they'll, in the writing of the screening criteria or in the writing of the interview question, they're going to try to broaden it out as much as they can, because we want to have, we want to be able to look at a wider pool of people with different strengths, right? So it's not just community college experience that we're looking for. We're looking for the best possible candidate, at least in theory, right? And oftentimes it happens that the people that can speak most to the issues, and honestly, who speaks most of the real unfair advantage that people have in this whole process are full-time faculty of other institutions, right? Because they have the opportunities to participate in professional development sessions that give them more awareness of what's going on in the field, right? So that's really, that's something that we have to work on. But outside of that, I haven't seen, any kind of discrimination against, folks that are coming in the K-12, sector, or folks that are coming in from the university sector, right? My colleagues, that usually does these presentations with me, she was coming from a private institution, right? She had only taught, Belinda Lum, she had only taught at I want to say it was like University of San Diego. That was her teaching experience was, right? As a research faculty. So significantly different experience than mine, right? I had only taught 3 semesters as a community college part-time faculty member. And, we were both offered second interviews and eventually offered tenure track and tenure positions. So that kind of shows you a little bit of the range. And also I have colleagues that have no teaching experience, right? That come from the field, depending on the discipline, right? I'm thinking of like, some of the disciplines like aeronomics and things of that nature. So I would say apply now, if nothing else, just to get experience the process, and let go of some of that that anxiety or fear around it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Mhm.
Sorry, it's me again.
Go for
You
it.
said that there are about 6 to 7 questions usually. Are they, so I'm looking again at that list that Jackie shared. Would they come from, let's say, one from each of those categories, or would they, I'm trying to kind of imagine what they would be. Or are they, let's say, 2 about equity, and how are they kind of structured?
Yeah, so it's hard to say exactly, where the questions come from. The most boring answer to that question is that they're going to come from the job description. Okay, that's pretty lame. But what I can say is, okay, that you're going to have you can anticipate the tell us about yourself question. That's question number 1, always, right? Okay, so that leaves you about 5 left, right? There's going to be some sort of teaching presentation, right? If you're instructional. So, okay, that's about 4 left. There's going to be a content-based one, right? So that leaves 3. So what are going to be the 3 that are still going to be there? If I had to guess for this next round, I would look, first of all, trends in the broader field. Distance education is there, online education, right? So there's probably going to be a question about, online education. If you're teaching in math or English, there's probably going to be a question in there about policy, right? Changing policy, like AB 705, right? Like cohort, right? Cohort teaching, like that kind of stuff. If you're in counseling, right, there's probably going to be stuff around like pathways, or, you know what I mean? Just what's in the landscape, right? There's probably going to be questions around that. So those would be the 3. And then within that also, I can guarantee you there's going to be an equity question.
Yeah.
So distance ed, equity, and then whatever's happening in your field.
Okay, thank you.
Nadine, I think, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing folks' name.
Actually, I'm so sorry. No, because I'm using my my phone for this meeting. I was in the office hour. That's why it shows my nickname. My name is Navid. I have been in your workshop before. I'm from the French department. Thank you for holding this meeting. I just had a question. I mean, a couple of questions might be very basic for the one who are here, but it always crosses my mind that, like for instance, our department, we don't have the chair because the chair of the department retired. And then we are just a couple of adjuncts running the department, and we were lucky to have even more than one. It was just like one adjunct running the whole thing, just one class. Is there any help for departments like that, especially in the second language, to offer any full-time position, or it just depends? I mean, there's no kind of like anything that would indicate that shows that the college is ready to offer. And also, if they open it, how much time do we have to prepare for the interview? Like, is like a short notice, or they give us enough time to prepare, etc. And what happens in general as far as the questions, the type of questions they ask for second language, especially if there are a number of faculties attending? Do they all need to speak that specific language, or do they invite professor from other departments? Because I'm asking, because when I was doing actually my thesis in my home country, they had to invite a couple professors from a different department because we didn't have enough in the panel to question me with that language.
Yeah,
so I hope I was clear
So
with my question.
Yeah, I'll explain first the process, the typical process.
Thank you.
This process I'm not an expert on, so I don't have like the specific date, but I know that during the fall semester, right, a department will present to academic senate, right, and they'll sort of make a request of a position or 2 positions or multiple positions, and then academic senate will take those requests. It goes through a process where they either say yes, we need these positions, or no, we don't need these positions, and then academic senate, I want to say, presents that to the president, or they do something, right, like the administration and academic senate, go through a process where they select what positions are going to get awarded, and then in the spring, usually around March or February, like in February and March, the positions are posted, and candidates can apply, and then interviews typically happen in April, right? So from when you apply to the position to when you're notified about an interview is roughly about a month, right? And then, after you interview, is usually probably about another 2 weeks, 1 week to 2 weeks before they call you and say, hey, you have another interview coming up. And then, if you're successful through that interview and you're offered a position, then you won't begin work till late August, right? So it's a pretty lengthy process, right?
Okay.
So that's kind of like the general process. In the fall, the departments request, right? Make the request. In the spring, they interview and hire folks or offer positions, and then those folks begin work the following fall. So it takes a while, and in between, and then, through all that, you're offered when you were asked to come in and interview, there's they will let you know some of the details, like if there's a presentation that you're going to be doing, right? They will let you know that. If they're and then when you show up to the interview, you'll have access to the questions, for about 10 minutes before the interview begins. In regards to the number of committee members, right, especially for a small department, if there's not enough full-time faculty members, then yeah, there would be other faculty members of that division, right? So it may be that other faculty members come in from that division, but not that same language, right? But there usually tends to be like a content expert, right?
Okay.
So that.
Because as far as the demo like teaching, when I was hired, the professor was here, who was teaching the language, and so she could actually evaluate my qualification in the language as well, not just a fact of
teaching,
general teaching, which I think it was very important, because later she could actually give me all the feedback. She couldn't do it during the meeting, but I made like mistakes I made and stuff like that. So that was a perfect experience. That was the question, actually. Thank you so much. I think I appreciate your time. This was great.
Of course. Is that everybody? Any other questions? Speak now, or before I end the Zoom, and then you have to email. All right. Well, thank you all for hanging out. About 48 minutes after the scheduled end of our session. I hope this was helpful, and feel free again to reach out if there's further questions that you may have. Send me an email. We can schedule some time. We can chat. Be happy to help any way I can.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
all.
Have a nice weekend.
You too. Enjoy, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Jesus, so much. Thanks.
Of course. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Have a nice day.